Good. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our fifth and unfortunately final class on this text, Bodhisattvas Jewel Garland by Lama Atisha. So let's get started as we usually do with reciting the refuge verse. So let me get that on the screen. Got to scroll down a little here. We'll do this once in English and then twice chanting the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyapsu chi daki chunyan gipe sanam gi dola penchir sangye duparsho. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyapsu chi daki chunyen gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye duparsho. Okay, let's do a short meditation. Again, we'll just spend the first few minutes in silent meditation on the breath in order to focus the mind a bit. And then I'll come in and lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation of bodhicitta for tonight's class. So again, work with the breath in whatever technique you prefer, trying to keep the awareness with the breath. When the mind wanders, just gently guide the mind back to the breath. So we'll begin the meditation now. So now let's set our motivation of bodhicitta. And to do this tonight, right, recall one of the last teachings that Lama Yeshe gave, which happened to be on the topic of bodhicitta. And in that teaching, he said that one of the most frustrating things that we have in our lives is our inability to help others to the degree that we would like to. And I've been thinking about this verse in relation to what's going on in our world. So much division, so much conflict, things continuing to be, the product of all the delusions, especially the root of ignorance. Why these things keep happening, why human beings in particular keep inflicting harm on each other, is because they are under the control of these factors. Lama Yeshe's answer to that dilemma of looking at the world and the beings in it and recognizing that we can't help to the degree that we would like is, of course, bodhicitta. It is our response to the suffering of the world. It is what we can do. Certainly, we can do things in the moment to the best of our ability, but to really address the fundamental problems of the root ignorance, all the other delusions, the karma that's created, the continual cycling from life to life. In order to interrupt all of that, we have to become a Buddha. We have to be more qualified. Then we can very skillfully, spontaneously, effortlessly, and perfectly help all sentient beings to do that work. So as we set our motivation of bodhicitta for tonight, we try to hold that awareness that this is the best way to respond to whatever we see that we call suffering, difficulty, dissatisfaction. It's the only way out for us to be able to help all sentient beings to be free from the causes of dukkha, dissatisfaction, and to attain liberation from all problems and difficulties, and moreover, attain enlightenment, the completion of their potential. We hold the thought that we are doing this tonight so we can become a Buddha, to be able to help sentient beings accomplish that goal. And then we can open our eyes fully, and we'll start tonight's class. So this is the final class. We have a number of verses to complete in regard to this, but again, there's some that don't really require too much commentary, and then of course a few more that I will comment on to a larger degree. But any questions on anything we've covered so far up to this point, or things that need addressing before we go into new material? No? Okay. All right, so we are working with this wonderful text. Let me just kind of go right to the text on the page that you all have access to at the Wisdom Publications, who have kindly offered this as a way for us to be able to go through this text, this translation by Thupten Jinpa. We were on verse 17. We finished 16 in the last class, verse 17. The very first line of this I want to talk about first. Always remain firm in your commitment. There's different translations of this. It's kind of interesting. I mean, we can certainly say that, all of Buddhism, particularly in the Mahayana, and with regard to bodhicitta, we have a strong commitment we are making to our spiritual development. And we can take it in that very basic way that Thupten Jinpa translates it as we have to remain firm in this commitment to benefit all sentient beings, to continue our spiritual development all the way to achieving our own potential of Buddhahood. But nonetheless, there are different translations of this, and I found it kind of interesting because there's that, once more, I mentioned at the very beginning of this course, sometimes we have a tantric kind of interpretation to this text. And that's in Alex Berzin's translation that he did in his commentary on this. He said there, meaning in sort of meditation and retreat, because that's what we've been talking about in the prior class, was kind of setting up this ideal situation where we could be in solitude and have this ideal period of internal investigation and development. He says, there, let me always be stable with my Buddha figure. There's this term yidam in Tibetan. Yidam essentially means our meditational deity. And what happens when you enter into the path of Tantra, as most of you know, you have initiation into a particular Buddha figure. And ideally, it's good to talk to a guru, a lama, to find out what your particular yidam is, the meditational deity that kind of suits your predisposition. In Tantra, there are also 4 different classes, and the main ones that we have initiation for in the Tibetan tradition are the first one, the Action Tantra, or Kriya Tantra, as it's called in Sanskrit, and then Anuttara Yoga Tantra, I think is the Sanskrit name. That's highest yoga tantra. So we have like the first one and the fourth one that tend to be where tantric initiations are given. The tantric teachings say that in order to accomplish enlightenment, you have to kind of take on the practice of a particular Buddha figure. The tantric path is about bringing the result of Buddhahood into the present moment. So we think of ourselves through having been initiated into a particular practice as being that Buddha. So it involves a lot of imagination, visualization, to hold the view of ourselves as this perfectly pure, fully developed being, all others as being the same state, and then, of course, living and abiding in this realm of the Buddha, the mandala and what have you, celestial mansion of that Buddha, trying to purify our view of everything. Because in the tantric teachings, the main obstacle we're trying to overcome is our attachment to ordinary appearance. Thinking that we're this ordinary being trapped in this flesh and blood body and what have you. We have to kind of transcend that through tantric practices to attain the fully enlightened state. So it's a very wonderful practice, a very rich practice, and it does involve maintaining an awareness and a kind of commitment to staying in that mode of seeing oneself as that being, that enlightened being that we are trying to become by practicing the tantric path. So there is that idea of kind of remaining firm in our kind of tantric practice and holding on to the view of our yidam. And of course, what the yidam represents, which is our desire to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings, our bodhicitta kind of in the context of Tantra. So this is what Geshe Ngawang Dargye says on this topic, again, because Alex Burson, I think, was involved in the teachings and maybe the translation as well of the text that I'm citing frequently, this book, Advice from a Spiritual Friend. Geshe Ngawang Dargye says, to stabilize our personal deity or yidam means that we should always confirm the motivation for our actions and bear in mind the goal of complete union with the fully awakened state that our yidam symbolizes. The Buddha figure that we're working with, if it's, in highest yoga tantra, it could be Yamantaka or Haruka Chakra Samvara or Kala Chakra. There's many different deities, Buddha figures that you can be initiated into. You want to hold that in mind, that what you're trying to achieve is that complete union with that state that these beings represent, which is the union of bliss and emptiness, this wonderful accomplishment of the 2 aspects of the path, the method side of the path and the wisdom side of the path, which is, of course, is the same result in the sutra presentation, but in Tantra, you again just have different practices to help you to get there. So the idea behind this line is you can take it in a couple of different ways. Certainly just staying true to your commitment that you are trying to maintain throughout your practice, especially when you're in more serious retreat, as we were discussing again in the prior verses. Or in a tantric context, if you are doing tantric retreat and working with tantric practice, then you have to kind of stay true to the particular yidam that you are practicing and try to do your best to actualize that within this motivation of wanting to become enlightened as quickly as possible for the benefit of others, which is the tantric initiation, adding that idea of becoming enlightened as quickly as possible because we see that others are suffering. Verse 18, to go on to this verse, it says, I'm just going to read the whole verse in this case. However, if you do encounter others, meaning while you are in retreat, because obviously we were talking about solitude again last week and the solitude that is ideal for retreat. If you do encounter others, And of course, this can apply to us as we go about our daily lives and wherever we live, who we encounter. Speak peacefully and truthfully. Do not grimace or frown, but always maintain a smile. Again, this starts sounding like just kind of really good basic advice about how to be a decent human being. You know, if we speak peacefully, calmly, gently with others, always be truthful in what we are saying, never try to deceive others with our speech. Don't grimace or frown. No, don't give bad looks to everybody that you see, but always maintain a smile. I think there's some benefit to that about being in the world. I know it can be difficult in some settings. Those of you who live in New York City, I'm sure that it's not that easy to go walking around New York City smiling at everyone that you see. They might think you're a little bizarre and stay away from you or something. But the idea is that we want to have that at least inside ourselves, this kind of allowing people to be around us without any fear of anything that we will do to them, any harm we'll cause to them. Rather have this kind of, again, that we talked about, that inner flame that we is the product of our practice, that we want to always have within ourselves and kind of operate from that place. But nonetheless, I think it is useful in general to be kind of greeting people with smiles, being friendly to them. I look at His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Everyone he meets is greeted with a smile, with a warm laugh, what have you. So again, I think this is generally good advice. I skipped something. I skipped the rest of 17. I'm sorry. I jumped to 18. All right, let me see if I can finish off that verse. Was there something I was going to say on that? On verse 18, and then we'll jump back to 17 and finish that. I apologize. He says, this is again from Shantideva's text. I've been citing this frequently because it's interesting how many of the ideas in Shantideva's way of the Bodhisattva are mirrored in our text. Verse 571. Again, chapter 5 is a big one. Been a number of citations from that in my teaching on this. Be the master of yourself and have an ever smiling countenance. Rid yourself of scowling, wrathful frowns, and be a true and honest friend to all. We're going to have this idea about not being a fickle friend coming up later in verse 21. But the rest of it really applies to what we're talking about here. Just be a decent person, be a good human being, have a warm heart with whoever you meet. There's a little Tibetan phrase from this interesting treasury of Tibetan proverbs called Like a Yeti catching marmots. Anyway, it's a fun little book to kind of read through and hear these Tibetan proverbs. In that is a smile wins 100 hearts, a frown not even one. And there's that idea of you get more flies with honey than vinegar. It's that whole same concept that we see in many proverbs of just like being a kind person to other people is much more conducive to being with them and being in harmony with them than to, greet them with a frown, a grimace, what have you. Let's go back to the rest of 17. Again, sorry for inverting the order of these. So from B through D, the last three lines. When a hint of procrastination and laziness arises, we've talked about laziness previously towards the beginning of the course, so I'm not going to go into that much detail on laziness, but this can obviously arise even when we're in retreat and want to be dedicated to greater practice and not having all the distractions. We still might get lazy and have some putting off of our practice. At that instant, Lama Atisha says, enumerate your flaws and recall the essence of spiritual conduct. Really recall what we're doing and how we have to overcome these, he calls them flaws, so, the obstacles that we have to engaging fully in practice. And recall that to be a good practitioner means being dedicated to doing what we can, especially when we're in time that's dedicated for retreat. And this is a mistake, of course, a lot of people have with their practices. They don't practice well before retreat. They get into retreat and they find the same problems that were plaguing them outside of retreat are there still. You take them with you, when you go into a retreat setting. So the patterns of procrastination, laziness, being attached to sleep, not really having good discipline, all that's why we have to have those every day. That's why we have to, as much as possible, engage in kind of creating a pattern that can then be rested upon. It's the basis, the foundation for success in retreat. If we just go about our daily life and don't really do much, and then we go off to a 1 month retreat or something, we might end up wasting a lot of time. just trying to get the mind to settle, trying to do the practice. So we always have to recall, what is the nature of our practice? What is it that we're really trying to achieve? And be very true to that and maintain that kind of, again, discipline that is so necessary. And we don't get to enlightenment without some form of discipline. The advice from Geshe Ngawang Dargye says that we should follow the example of Geshe Ben Kungyo. Geshe Ben Kongyo is this wonderful kind of, I don't know if he was a Kadampa Geshe, but he was in that same lineage of these amazing teachers that followed from Lama Atisha. He was formerly a thief in his life before he met the Dharma. Anyway, Geshe Ben Kongyo, when he found himself getting lazy, he would say to himself, if you do not watch out, I'm going to tell everyone exactly what you're doing and expose you in a disgraceful way. He had this tendency of like talking to himself in a way that was very clever. We should follow our inner teacher and correct our own faults. This inner discipline and regret at mistakes is the essence of the practice. We have to have some level of these factors, again, that we talked about previously, of like self-respect, consideration for others, and so on, some conscientiousness. We need to have those so that we can kind of keep an eye on our own behavior and on what we're doing in regard to our practice. One of the other really interesting stories about Geshe Ben Kongyo was when he was in a gathering with a lot of other monks or what have you, and he was towards the back because, of course, you are seated with the monks or nuns in your section based on your ordination date. And so he came to the Dharma later in his life, I guess, and he was seated quite a ways back. And he saw that during the break in the puja, they were coming around with yogurt to put it in the bowls of all of the monks. And he saw himself watching them do this, like wondering, oh, they're giving out more and more there and more there in the next row, more and more. He was getting like really anxious, like, I'm not going to get any yogurt. And then he caught himself. This is the clever thing about Geshe Ben Kongyo. He'd always like catch himself doing something and know exactly what he needed to do then. When the monk finally arrived with the bowl of yogurt, there was still some to dish out. But Geshe Ben Kongyo told him, he turned his bowl over and he said, no yogurt for this naughty monk. He's already had his. So the idea is that he was very clever in finding these ways to talk to himself, to point out his own faults, kind of point out the ways in which he was not living up to the ideals of the Dharma. I told you he was a thief. I'll tell you one more story about him that I've heard. I wish there were more Geshe Ben Kongyo stories because I find them really quite interesting. Because he was a thief, he had this tendency of being attracted to taking things. And the story is that he was visiting some kind of maybe on a wandering monk kind of thing, and some couple put him up in their place, and they left him alone in the kitchen area where there was some barley. And he saw himself getting ready to take barley out of the bag. And then he grabbed his hand with his other hand and said, "Stop, thief." And they came in from the other room and they go, "Where's the thief?" And he says, "Here, I've caught the thief. He was trying to steal your barley." you know? So anyway, we have to do whatever we can to kind of be that force in our lives. We don't have to necessarily announce it to the world, but we have to have some discipline around our practice so that we stay true to what we're doing. So these Geshe Ben Kongyo stories, maybe they'll be a little inspiring in terms of the way that we can change our lives by having that type of discipline. Verse 19, in general, when you see others, be free of miserliness and delight in giving. Relinquish all thoughts of envy. Of course, these two ideas of like miserliness and envy, they both generally revolve around things that either that we have that we don't want to give to others, or that others have that we would rather have for ourselves. So we want to kind of be the opposite to those. Have a mind that delights in giving. When they say in Chandra Kirti's text that we studied in the master's program, the supplement to the middle way, they go through the respective perfections, and the very first of the six perfections of the Bodhisattva is giving. And they say when a Bodhisattva hears the words, I need, or I want, or whatever, this brings them incredible joy. Like to hear that somebody wants something, somebody needs something. Could you spare $1? Can you give me a ride? Can you do whatever? They take delight in that. Hearing that they are needed by others, that they have an opportunity to practice generosity is music to their ears. So we have to kind of reverse those tendencies of being miserly, holding on to everything that we have, and wishing to be very free with the resources we own, with our time, with whatever it is that people are needing of us. And of course, when it comes to observing what they have, envy, jealousy, whatever, they use these terms somewhat interchangeably, though I think they have slightly different meanings. But the idea is when we're looking upon what other people possess and having some desire to have those things ourselves, that's, not a very happy mind to have as well, because it's caught up in attachment and desire for those others' possessions. And we tend to even get somewhat upset when we see other people who have good fortune, you know, kind of look at them and go, they're not such great people. How do they end up with such good fortune of having all this wealth and having this status and whatever the case might be? The antidote to that kind of jealousy or, that problematic mind when we observe the good fortune of others is to rejoice. The practice of rejoicing is a very important one in Buddhist practice, to really take delight and joy in someone having good things in their lives. Now, where did those good things come from? If we're talking about this whole generosity, that said that anything that anyone has, whether it be us or others, comes from our practice of generosity. Why does that person who we think that maybe we have in the back of our mind, or perhaps the front of our mind, that they don't deserve that good fortune, they don't deserve to have all that wealth? Karmically, they do. Karmically, they had to have created the causes for that by practicing generosity in the past. So we can take delight and rejoice in the fact that they did engage in all of that good karma of generosity and so on that has resulted in them having those things. Now, what they're doing with those things in this life may be, just getting greedier and more miserly and what have you. We won't take delight in that. You don't rejoice in that. But you can rejoice in the fact that those beings had that good fortune due to their own past good karma. So again, these are patterns that we have to kind of break, of feeling like we are, um, not going to give what we have, or we're not going to take delight in what others have. Just a few things on verse 19 from Geshe Awandargi again. Envy or jealousy is another major hindrance to happiness. If we are jealous of others, we shall always be in a state of emotional instability. You can see how jealousy plagues our minds and doesn't allow us to be just kind of content with what is going on. The other person's good fortune, our own kind of contentment, satisfaction with what we have. Should others succeed in their work, he says, the resentment we feel from our envy will never affect them. It only causes unnecessary misery in us. This is true about so many of these afflictive emotions. When we look at it from that point of view, we're just torturing ourselves by having jealousy or anger, resentment, all these various things, right? The opponent for envious thoughts, as I mentioned earlier, is rejoicing in the accomplishments of others. And rejoicing is just simply bringing those things to mind and generating joy, generating this feeling of like taking delight in, again, the good things about that person, the things they did to accomplish that, which we don't know directly, but we can infer. As I said, anytime anybody has anything in their life that is a good result, a happy result, it arises from their virtuous conduct of the past. And we can infer it on the basis of the teachings that the Buddha gave. But this is an important practice for us to do. And it really is the complete antidote to the jealous mind that is upset and disturbed by the fact that other people have things that we don't possess. So, again, maybe that's enough on that verse. As I said, a lot of these tonight are not really requiring a whole lot of commentary. Verse 20, to help soothe others' minds, forsake all disputation. Stop getting in kind of contention with others, having conflict with others, and be endowed with forbearance. It is really true. We have so many times when we just uh, are upset with others. We do things to divide ourselves from others. Look at the political climate in this country right now. And I'm sure it's around the world in many different places because of what's happening politically, even in our global environment. But essentially, these sorts of mind states are not beneficial to creating a more harmonious world. To kind of look upon others with some disdain for who they are, their political views, whatever that might be. We have to understand that those views, of course, are a product of various causes and conditions. The person themselves is still an object of compassion, an object of uh, loving kindness and wanting them to be happy and be free from suffering and so on. To look at them and have disdain for them or to get into conflict with them. And of course, sometimes we just like having conflict for the sake of conflict. We don't necessarily even have anything that we're necessarily trying to prove to anyone else. We're just getting caught up in our own I'm right, you're wrong kind of mentality. This is a little bit of what comes out in the bits of commentary I'm sharing with you on the screen. First from Alex Berzin. He says, we try to please others to make them happy and to not contradict them. That's what contention means, or what was in our text, it was disputation, to contradict somebody and to argue with them. Tsongkhapa said it very nicely. If you simply agree with the other person, that ends the argument. We just agree. I agree with you. I'm not going to argue with you. Then it's all finished, But what happens to us is we get kind of this stubborn streak in ourselves, right? And we think, I have got to hold on to my point of view regardless and do everything I can to defend it in the face of this other person who is opposed to me. That doesn't lead, again, to a more harmonious world. It leads to more and more division. So we have to be mindful of that. This disputation for the sake of disputation is only going to create problems for ourselves and for others. There's a, there's a verse from the 8 Verses of Thought Transformation. I think I had another quote from this. This is Geshe Langri Tangpa's text, which was, I think, one of the first written texts of the Lojong tradition after Lama Atisha, the Tibetans that were teaching this and practicing it. Many of you know this verse. When out of envy, others mistreat me with insults, abuse, and the like, I shall accept defeat and offer the victory to others. This is this whole idea of like, why do we always have to win? What is so hard about offering the victory to others, letting them win in especially what are quite trivial things that aren't, if a life is at stake, well, maybe it's a little different. But if we're essentially just being with others, trying to be in the world, and people are putting forth views or things that they hold to that we are in opposition to, give them the victory. What does it matter? Again, there might be times where we have to say something. That's what Alex says here in this quote. There are certain limits, though, he says. If a person is going to do something destructive, we do have to set limits. If somebody says, look, let's go out and shoot kangaroos, maybe Jay can talk to that in Australia. But I don't know how often we have people shooting kangaroos anywhere else. But anyway, if somebody says, let's go engage in something that you know to be not a good activity, well, you set a limit. You say, no, you don't agree to that. However, if they say the sky is green and we say, no, it's blue, well, there's no point going on arguing. Who cares? There's a really cute story. I won't share the whole story. It's in a wonderful book called Who Ordered This Truckload of Dung by Ajahn Brahm. Maybe you've heard of it. There's a story in there called Chicken or Duck. And it's about a couple who are walking along on a nice little evening in the summer or something, and they're a nice little kind of a nature pathway out in a more rural area. And suddenly they hear quack, quack, quack. And the one says, oh, listen, it's a chicken. The other goes, no, that's a duck. And they get into this huge argument about whether it's a duck or a chicken. And eventually the one realizes, who's been so stubborn, saying it's a duck because it's quacking, right? Quack, quack, quack. They really know that it's a duck. That's their absolute belief. And they cannot believe this person thinks it's a chicken. But finally they get to the point where they go, oh, no, 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 you're right. It is a chicken. Let go of it. Who cares if it's a duck or a chicken? I use this sometimes frequently to myself. Maybe this is my Geshe Ben Kongyo kind of voice. Hey, this is duck or chicken stuff. Why go there? And look at even how this comes up in relationships. If you have a relationship with a partner, a wife, husband, spouse, whatever, and you get into this argument about something that has no real gravity to it, it's just something that you won't even care about in probably 24 hours, maybe even less. But you get into your kind of fixed point of view and you absolutely know that you've got to convince the other person that you're right and they're wrong. About what? Usually pretty meaningless stuff. So you can remember green or blue, like Alex said, in terms of the sky. Is it a green sky or a blue sky? Who cares? I mean, does it really matter that you convince that person that the sky is blue? Does it really matter that you convince that quacking is, a chicken, is a duck and not a chicken? I mean, Come on, folks. We have to be a little more serious about things. Again, if you do have things where people are engaging in unhealthy habits and behaviors on the basis of their views or whatever, that might be something different. But I love how Alex, and this is very relevant again in the US right now with everything happening politically. He says this verse is relevant, especially when there's a political or religious argument and the other person absolutely will not listen to anything we say. What's the point? Then it becomes idle chatter to just go on and on. So we just say, okay, let's talk about something else, and it's finished. We have that power to be able to kind of finish something ourselves, but instead we get kind of enticed by the back and forth. It's like playing a match of tennis or something, and we hit it one way, and then it gets hit back at us, and we hit it again, and it's pointless. It really doesn't drive us to any great conclusions, and we might even create even further division with the person that we're talking with, right? This is the unfortunate side of it, is that we can end up destroying a good friendship on the basis of holding on to something so tightly that we feel we have to convince the other person of the truth of. And again, they're going to have their own view. Certainly in politics, this is the case, right? Yeah. We're not going to convince them to change their minds necessarily. You might be able to, work some things in there, but we have to be very careful about that kind of stubborn streak that can play out in that way, causing us to have contention and disputation with others. Verse 21 says, "Be free of flattery and fickleness in friendship." I got some F's in that sentence, right? Free of flattery and fickleness in friendship. Obviously you want to be kind of a good friend. What do they say? A friend in need is a friend indeed. But, a friend is really someone who has an ability to stay true to people, regardless of what's going on, to not need to be engaged in any kind of flattery, fickleness, being a good friend at times and then a bad friend at other times. Be steadfast and reliable at all times. Do not disparage others, but always abide with respectful demeanor. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this course, some of these do sound like just good kind of common sense sort of things. And I think this may be the one where Alex Berzin talks about mismanners. Many of you know mismanners as columnists that would give you kind of what is the right appropriate thing to do in particular situations in the world among other people. But this is kind of, again, pretty good advice. Why should we? If we're trying to create a more harmonious world, which is, I think, part of our Bodhisattva agenda. The Bodhisattva agenda is essentially, as we've been discussing with the idea of bodhicitta, I want to benefit others. I want to help them to be free of suffering and to find happiness. Well, then why would we get into arguments with them? Why would we, disparage them? Why would we do anything that's going to upset those beings if we really are concerned about their welfare? This is why I do think we have to be very careful. You notice that many of the things are referring to something we're going to actually touch on towards the end of this text as well, which is speech. How we speak to others, the things we say to others. We have to be very meticulous and careful in that so that we're not destroying relationships and messing with other people's, state of mind and what have you. So don't disparage them, be respectful. Why not? Again, this is a good way to exemplify, be an example to others of the bodhisattva behavior and how to be in the world. And it really does help with the people that we interact with. Now, the question might come up, and this is what Alex entertains in this, that's why I'm sharing this. Well, what do we do when people come to us just to exploit us? People who just want to get something from us, and who, when they no longer find us useful, go away. First of all, if we're practicing as bodhisattvas, we are happy if they come to us. We are happy if we can help them. If they go away, well, that's their loss, and it's sad that they are no longer open to our help. I might mention that in some teachings Lama Zopa Rinpoche gave way back in 2009 at the Light of the Path retreat in North Carolina. He was citing some verses from Shantideva, again, that wonderful text that I mentioned a number of times. And in it, essentially, Shantideva is saying that bodhisattvas want to be used. We have this context in our culture that being used is not a good thing, right? But if we look at it from the point of just changing that word even a little bit, what does it mean to be useful to others? It means, in a sense, that you are going to be used. Other people are going to use what you have, your time, your talents, your money, your resources, whatever, and take make that into something that benefits them. Well, for the bodhisattvas, again, that's music to their ears, just like, the idea I was mentioning earlier when someone says, can I have this? Can I, do you have some money for me? Whatever. This is actually what bodhisattvas live for, is to be used by others, to be useful to others, to actually have that ability to do something that will benefit them. So again, this idea of being exploited. Now, there may be situations where people do greatly abuse things, and then in those cases, you might have to draw a line. I'll have some more from Alex Berzin in a moment that speaks to that. But in general, this whole idea of being used, this is a concept. And this is a framework or a perspective that we can put on something. We could look at this and say, oh, this person is just using me. That's one perspective. But for the bodhisattva, they often want to see it in the perspective of, oh, I'm being useful for this person. I'm actually helping them. I'm actually doing something for them. Again, we have to be careful. This, I know, of course, in our culture, we have a lot of awareness of what it means to be kind of codependent with those people who have issues where they just keep using another person to facilitate their own problematic way of being and seeing things and what have you. We have to be careful that we're not facilitating someone else's misbehavior. And that's understandable, right? We do have to have that kind of tough love at those times to be able to say, no, I've helped you, and it's really time for you to help yourself now. And I can help you with that process, but I really have to kind of cut you off at some level. Otherwise we are facilitating someone else's demise in a sense. They're moving down patterns of behavior that are only going to be harmful to them. So we do have to be careful, as Alex says in this next slide. Now, in regard to exploitation, we give what's appropriate. We don't overgive, which could be harmful to them and to us. We don't let them be a complete drain on us. Again, we set limits. Maybe that's a title for a course, Bodhisattvas with boundaries. It is good to have some kind of boundaries. Being a bodhisattva doesn't mean that you just give with no intelligence, no wisdom. This is what Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, never met him, never really had that major connection with him, but Pema Chodron, in talking about him, says that he actually called this idiot compassion. A compassion that is driven to do something to benefit others, that's not using our wisdom. It becomes idiotic because we're not actually thinking about what is necessary in the moment. How do we benefit that person in the moment? So being exploited to that greater degree where we feel like this person is engaging in behavior that's really not healthy for them. It doesn't allow them to be responsible for their own actions, for their own kind of what they are trying to create in their lives. And so we step back, perhaps. We do set limits. We have a boundary so that we can say, I will facilitate you in the process of standing on your own feet, but I'm not going to continue to just facilitate your inability to you know, have what you need every day, what have you, and to kind of uh, prey on others in a sense, out of that sense of exploitation that Alex is talking about. It gets tricky again, but bodhisattvas can have boundaries, certainly. And then another quote from this wonderful Lama that was mentioned, I think, in the last class, in terms of the advice he gave Alex about what to do with one's time, one's life. As Ringo Toko said very nicely, so many people might ask us for things, but there are only so many requests that we can fulfill. And we can't multiply ourselves into a million forms at the same time yet. We're not yet Buddhas. They say Buddhas, of course, can do this. Buddhas have that ability to manifest in myriad ways for the benefit of beings. They have no limit to it. It's not like, oh, I can only manifest 100 forms. They can manifest infinite forms to benefit others. Nonetheless, we at least try to give them something, a little something, so we're not totally rejecting them. I think that's so true. Sometimes we might say, well, oops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go. I wanted to get back to take this off screen. Sometimes there may be situations where we can't help, but that doesn't mean we can't at least offer our sympathy or our concern for that person, and maybe even say prayers for that person, kind of hold them in that light. There will be times where we think, this is way beyond what I feel I can do. I don't have the skills, ability, resources to be able to help someone in this way, but I can still hold them in my prayers. I can still do things that from a distance are, there to try to create some positive energy for them. Don't get to that place where we kind of feel like there's nothing I can do for this person. I need to shut them out of my life and get them, off the stage, whatever. try to hold some view of at least something that we can do for others, even if it's just holding good thoughts for them. And here's the mismanners bit that I mentioned earlier. Now, he says, when it comes to telling someone we can't do something, such as in those situations where we feel like it's beyond our capacity and we've reached our limit, he says he's reminded of a lovely line from Miss Manners. Miss Manners, as he explained in his teaching, is an American newspaper's etiquette queen, of whom one asks questions about etiquette. Miss Manners, Miss Good Manners, says that in such situations, we just say, I'm so sorry. We don't give excuses. So you just say, I'm so sorry, I can't do that. I find that this is hard for me to do. Whenever someone asks for something and I feel like I can't do it at that moment, or just I always want to give so many excuses, right? Well, I can't do it. I'm really busy right now. I have a lot going on. On that day, I got this, blah, 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 blah. Like I want to create all these excuses. And he brings up a very important point in this next slide, which is it just opens the door for more back and forth, right? If we do that. We don't give reasons why we can't help. We just say, oh, I'm so sorry, I won't be able to do that. We don't explain. If we were to explain, they'd give us an argument about it. And then we'd have to get defensive. We just say, I'm so sorry. Great guru, Miss Manners. um, and I kind of agree with that. I mean, I think there is something to be said for that. Just to not have that kind of entanglement of having to justify and defend everything that we do or don't do in relation to our, being able to help others. Because one of the things to keep in mind on the Bodhisattva path is that we don't have this absolute, like from the very beginning, capacity to do whatever it takes to benefit others. That's the whole process of building up our bodhicitta and our ability, our perseverance, our strength of mind, and what have you. Remember, there's the story of the Buddha when he was a bodhisattva and he was a young prince, and he and his two brothers were out one day and they came across a lioness, or no, it was a tigress who had given birth to 5 cubs. And it was during the middle of a drought, and the tigress was about ready to die. And of course, if she died, her cubs would die. And the Buddha, as that bodhisattva prince, realized that this was his perfect opportunity to extend generosity of his body to another being. And so he happily did that. And, that was a development of a very, like many, many lifetimes of wanting to practice that level of generosity. And then finally having the situation where that could be practiced. But for most of us, if we're out like walking, in nature somewhere and we see a mountain lion in a similar situation that's starving or something, we don't go, oh, good, I'm, open up my own flesh, cut my own throat so the tigress, lioness, whatever can eat, begin to feast on my body. That's just not where most of us are at. I'll admit that's not where I'm at in terms of my generosity, right? So the thing is that we acknowledge that this is a process. So when we do have to say no, when we do have to say, I'm sorry, I'm just not really comfortable doing that, or whatever, maybe that's even more of an excuse than what you should give. You just say, I'm sorry, I can't do that right now. And leave it at that. If somebody says, well, why can't you? And you say, well, just please accept the fact that I can't do that. Don't need to kind of go along and be, kind of at the mercy of whoever it is that's talking to you and whatever it is that they want. You can set limits. So anyway, that's enough on that probably. But the idea here is again, in general, we just want to be really conciliatory with people around us, be very respectful of people around us. And then if we do need to set limits, we do so in the most respectful way as well. Verse 23, I'm sorry, 22 says the first 2 lines, when giving advice, maintain compassion and altruism. I think this is kind of an interesting verse because oftentimes when we give advice, it's not necessarily coming from compassion and altruism. It might be coming from pride or from some other delusion, like, I'm going to put this person in their place and kind of give them what they really need because I know better than them. And we might be making some judgment on their abilities and what have you. Our advice and our way of working with others should always come from a place of compassion, of genuine concern for their welfare. And of course, as I was saying earlier, I mean, we have to unite that with some level of wisdom. Mm, idiot compassion, again, this phrase that Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche would use, sometimes that manifests too, right? Where we are doing stuff without really thinking about what it is that we're saying or doing for the other person. We do have to have kind of both of those in some measure. We don't have perfect wisdom yet. Wisdom is a very, again, something that grows over time. And when we develop greater realization, then we have greater wisdom. But whatever wisdom we have, we should bring to bear on situations, and out of a motivation of compassion, do what we can to help others, to give them the advice, the teachings that they need. I know it's very, very hard. Most of us don't feel like we're really capable of giving the advice to others and intervening to some degree. I might mention some advice that I always give to others in terms of doing this type of behavior when we do feel compelled out of compassion to say something to benefit another person, is to ask for permission to do that. I mean, most people don't like being told what to do. Once more, most of us will raise our hand to that, right? Thank you very much. I don't need someone else telling me what to do. We can have that in the West in particular, a strong reaction to authority figures and what have you. And if we come off as too much of that, well, then obviously that's going to be a turnoff for people. The way to approach giving advice to somebody, again, generated by our own altruistic motivation or wish to really benefit them, is to seek permission first. Say, I have some things I'd like to share with you, but it's really up to you. Are you open to hearing some things that might be useful in the situation that you're dealing with, or with what's going on with your partner or your life or your job or whatever the case might be? And if they say, oh yeah, I think I'd really like to hear that, well, then we have kind of we're speaking more as equals rather than I'm this person who knows exactly what you need to be doing and you should do it. Giving advice in that manner isn't really beneficial. So again, I think this is very simple, these two lines, but they nonetheless speak to trying to avoid anything. Whoops, it's not the one I wanted to bring up, I don't think. Oh yeah, I do have a little bit to say on this, but a little to share from Lama Gyurme. But it is important that we have this compassion as our underlying motivation for any time that we try to benefit someone else. He says, giving advice or offering guidance or even teaching should not be motivated by ulterior motives. It should not be driven by the desire to gain followers or any other personal gain. Your intention should be rooted in compassion and the genuine wish to aid others. Your aim should be to alleviate their ignorance regarding the Dharma and to impart wisdom to them. Again, but not from a place of superiority, from a place of genuine concern for their situation. All right, so with such thoughts in mind, now you should provide instructions or guided advice. Whenever you have the ability or opportunity, do so with compassion and a genuine desire to help. It doesn't matter whether that person has offered you something or not, whether you are seeking praise or fame. These concerns should not play a role. Remember, these are the worldly concerns that we touched on earlier in this course, especially when we are doing Dharma work and trying to be a benefit to others by sharing what wisdom we have from our own experience, from the teachings, and so on. We want that to be coming from a place of not having any expectation of what we receive from the other on the basis of that. Certainly, that's not a healthy state of mind. So then he concludes, he says, your sole concern should be the well being of that individual. How can you help them? How can you impart wisdom to them? How can you eliminate their ignorance? So again, we will see that no doubt there will be times where we feel very inept at providing teachings or advice to another. And in those cases, maybe it is best just to shut up and just listen to them, be a support to them. But if we do feel like we have something that can be shared, as I said, I think it's really good. It's not in any of these teachings from these other masters, but this is just something I think in the West is really important. Seek permission, see if someone is okay with you sharing what advice you have, and then try to do so again with a very compassionate mind, not out of, oh, I know this and you should know this too, and how can you be so stupid in doing what you're doing or whatever. We don't want to do it with that kind of mind state. So okay, let's carry on with the text with the remainder of verse 22. Never defame the teachings, whatever practices you admire, with aspiration and the 10 spiritual deeds. Strive diligently dividing day and night. So we see again this third line, never defame the teachings. Well, this is just really basic advice that is very good for anyone in any spiritual tradition, not to put down or defame the teachings that you are following. In Buddhism, the karma that is created, they say, when you do that with the Dharma, is that you create an obstacle to meeting the Dharma again. So we really want to hold the teachings with great reverence. And then, as it says here, whatever practices you admire, and by admire, it means kind of what inspires you, what really make you feel really good about doing, with aspiration and the 10 spiritual deeds. I'll talk about those in a moment. Strive diligently, do whatever you can to engage in them wholeheartedly, with great energy and enthusiasm. So these 10 spiritual deeds, there's kind of two different explanations of these. And the first one that I'm going to give you from Geshe Awan Dargye, he goes into the first perspective, is really from the vantage point of someone practicing the Bodhisattva path. And these are correlated then to what are called the 10 perfections. Most of you know the six perfections. I mentioned them earlier, generosity being the first one, and then morality, patience, joyous effort or enthusiasm, concentration, and then the sixth one being wisdom. Those are the general paramitas or practices of a bodhisattva, but there are actually four more that are said to be kind of an extension of your wisdom. And we'll look at those in a moment. They include skillful means, power, um, prayer, and exalted wisdom, which is a more elevated state of wisdom just before becoming a Buddha. But essentially, this is kind of the main Mahayana practice. And then there are 10 other things that are general spiritual practices in Buddhism that could be done by anybody who's Buddhist, not necessarily on the Mahayana path seeking Buddhahood. So let's take a look at this, and then I'll talk about them a little bit more. I actually have a handout that I will send along to Sheila, and she can have it distributed to all of you. A little short teaching from Alex Berzin that goes into the other presentation of the 10 spiritual practices. Geshe Awan Dargye says, as an awakening warrior, this is the term used for bodhisattva, we should intensively follow the practices of the 10 transcendent perfections, again, the paramitas as they're called in Sanskrit, meaning kind of the practices that go beyond, they transcend. They are how you become a Buddha through engaging in these. The first six are the commonly known ones that I just mentioned. I won't go through reading all those again, but we know that those are the six that are taught in the Lamrim texts and so on. The four additional ones are strength or power, prayers of aspiration for the path, skillful means or method. This is again an important part that is brought to its full culmination in Buddhahood, where you have the skillful means and ability to help others exactly in accord with their karma. And then finally, the 10th, the final one, primordial awareness or exalted wisdom, which is different than just the mere perfection of wisdom, number 6, in that it entails a greater knowledge of not just the reality of things, their emptiness, but also the varieties of conventional truths that exist, conventional things. So these are taught, I might mention, in Chandrakirti's text that I mentioned earlier, where he goes through and supplement to the middle way, he goes through all the 10 bhumis or grounds of the Bodhisattva. Each of these are brought to their culmination on one of these 10 grounds. The first six, of course, being the six perfections that we have. I'm going to show you a little chart here that you may have seen at one point or another. It's kind of the 5 paths of the Bodhisattva on the Mahayana. And if you look at this place from where it's got G there, this big line that says G, and that goes all the way through then to just before the area that says Buddha, you have the 10 grounds there, first through 10th. And you'll notice that in a vertical thing, it says each of the perfections: generosity, ethics, patience, joyous effort, concentration, wisdom, method, prayer, power, exalted wisdom. This is when each of these practices is kind of brought to their culmination. They become a surpassing practice at that. The perfections themselves are a case of giving the name of the result to the cause. They are the practices that result in the full perfection of Buddhahood. But nonetheless, they come to their culmination, each of these 10, as the Bodhisattva progresses closer and closer to Buddhahood. And I'm not going to go into any more kind of detailed description of that chart. It's just to show you that these are part of the Mahayana path, and we practice them as best as we can wherever we're at in our own bodhisattva practice, but we bring them to, again, a greater state as we get closer and closer to Buddhahood. The other way of explaining these 10 is brought up again. I think this is still Geshe Ngawang Dargye, but he says the aforementioned list is for those who are following practices of the great vehicle, the Mahayana. For those who do not engage actively in this path, there is another set of 10 general practices explained by Maitreya, the coming Buddha. Now, this doesn't mean that because these 10 are explained by Maitreya and we are on the Mahayana or we're destined for the Mahayana, we should ignore them. We can also engage in them, but for the Bodhisattva, those on the Mahayana path, the main practices are the 10 perfections. Those are our spiritual path. Those are what we are dedicated to because they're all motivated by bodhicitta, and we engage in them with that mind state. Okay, so these are the 10 practices called here the 10 practices of one day. Not that you can engage in all of these in one day. Maybe you could, but you probably wouldn't be for very long. Copying and writing out scriptures. And of course, this is different than, in modern, our days or our age, we can have these things printed up very quickly by printing presses and what have you. In the old days, of course, they needed text copied and written out so that they could be shared with others. Making offerings to the three supreme jewels, obviously an important practice for anyone who is Buddhist. 3, giving generously to the poor and sick. Again, generosity is among the 10 perfections I just talked about, but giving generously to those who are in need is very important. Number 4, listening to discourses on Dharma, like what you're doing right now. And of course, outside of class, listening on YouTube or going to other teachings, such as next Tuesday with Kandrola, this wonderful teacher. All of these are, wonderful ways to practice the Dharma by going to teachings. Number 5, reading scriptures to oneself and others. Often reciting the sutras is like the Heart Sutra or the Vajrakuta Sutra. Other sutras that are recommended, especially Lama Zopa had a number of sutras that he feels are very good to recite. Number 6, taking to heart the essence of the teachings through meditation. This is obviously an important part of our daily practice, to meditate on the teachings where we analyze and investigate them. Number 7, explaining the meaning of the Dharma. If we are in a position, again, not necessarily as a formal teacher, but with someone who needs the Dharma explained to them, then doing that is a really good practice. Number 8, reciting the Heart Sutra or any of Buddha's sutras. So it was mentioned in the previous one, reading scriptures to oneself and others. That could include things beyond sutras, perhaps, the commentaries, Lam Rim texts and what have you. Here, it's mainly looking at the sutras themselves, the Heart Sutra, and so on. Number 9, contemplating the meaning of the text. This is obviously something we want to do, not just recite the text, but really reflecting on the meaning. And then number 10, meditating single-pointedly on the meaning of the teaching. So kind of advancing our meditation to an even greater degree so that we realize the meaning of the teachings at a very deep level. Thus, we should perform the 10 transcendent perfections or the 10 daily practices, thereby pointing all our actions in a skillful direction. So this is what is shared by Geshe Ngawang Dargye. I, as I said, do have a little handout that I just pulled the teachings from Alex Berzin's teachings on this text that are at his website. That's called studybuddhism.org, I believe. I think that's the name of it. I don't think it's .com. Could be, but anyway, you'll find it easily enough. Study Buddhism. He again goes into a little bit more description on each of these things. I don't know that I need to go through all of this again, because this will be sent out to you and you can take a look at this. Reading scriptures, the way that he describes the difference between that and reciting sutras, reading scriptures about the teachings that we have particular admiration for. So that can be one way to understand that, is that if we are really interested in particular Lam Rim teachings, then we might read books that entertain that topic, and give us some more things to think about. That whereas reciting sutras is, reciting the sutras out loud, engaging in those kinds of more ritual things around the sutras that are very important to do as well. Anyway, there's he does say at the very end of this, at the bottom of the page, there are many things that can be included in this list that, of course, aren't transcribing teachings. If you have teachings that someone has given who you consider to be an admirable teacher, then you can transcribe what they have taught. Writing up the teachings we have received. And many people take notes as they receive teachings. Well, writing them up is another practice that can be useful because we review the teachings in our own minds. Making teachings available to others. These too are Dharma acts. The best way to familiarize ourselves with a teaching is to write it up after a class. I find that when I go to teachings, I haven't been to a teaching with His Holiness the Dalai Lama since 2014 in New York City when he taught on essence of eloquence. But anyway, I find that when I'm at a teaching, especially with someone like His Holiness, where you're getting all these kind of heavy duty teachings, it really helps to be engaged in some process of writing down what you're hearing. And then what was interesting when you're with like His Holiness, where he's speaking and teaching in Tibetan, then you can take the time when he's teaching in Tibetan to review what you just wrote and fill in gaps and what have you, things that you didn't get because you were writing so quickly. It's kind of an interesting exercise, to do that in the way that those teachings are given. Whereas when you're in a teaching like this, where somebody's teaching in English constantly, it's very hard to get it all down, right? But to do some sort of practice of writing or engaging in the teaching in some way after you've received it is kind of important. I know we're all kind of receiving teachings left and right, and it seems impossible to process them all as we're receiving so much. But it is an important part of it. If we're just kind of taking it in and it sort of remains, I use this analogy of like the foam that's on top of Tibetan beer, this chang, it's called. If it just stays on the surface as like floating there, I think they even had the idea. I think in their chang they put barley on the top for some reason, maybe to not get so intoxicated by the drink, so that they have something that they're putting in their stomach with the alcohol. But the idea is that just stays on floating on the surface. That's not how we want the teachings. We want the teachings to come into our being, to join up with our minds in a way that will have some noticeable effect on who we are and how we are in the world. So all of these practices can be assisting in doing that. So again, you'll get a copy of that full list of 10 with the bit more that Alex Berzin, explains in regard to them. But I think they're again something that's worthwhile, to at least take a look at. And then of course the last phrase there, strive diligently, dividing day and night. I don't remember what the footnote is to this, but essentially it doesn't mean that you do some things in the day and something you practice as much as you can. This is the whole goal. As you become more and more engaged in Buddhism, you want to use as much of your time to practice. I mean, I have to say that as a teacher, just one of the advantages of it is that I keep my mind in the Dharma so much more because I'm constantly reading things to prepare for classes and trying to put notes together and slides together and all the various things. It really does help to have that for my practice, to be engaged in the teachings in that way. But I think for all of us, we have to find what works in terms of dedicating more and more time to whatever we call Dharma practice. The essence of our practice is to change our minds. So that's really the goal, right? To remove what is negative, to advance what is positive. This is what all the Buddhist practice is about. But there are many doorways to get to that and to facilitate that process. You might think reading the Heart Sutra doesn't have anything to do with that. How do we change our minds by just reading a bunch of words that are on a page? But essentially, those every time we recite that, it brings it closer and closer to our minds, so that we have something that we can rely upon as a tool to help us to awaken that wisdom that is set out in the Heart Sutra, for example. So all of these practices that we do are all about facilitating the essence of spiritual practice, which is to develop our minds into the state of Buddhahood, which is the culmination of that process of removing everything that is negative and developing everything that is positive. So probably enough on that for now. Let's go to verse 23. Whatever virtues you gather through the three times, dedicate them toward the unexcelled great awakening. Of course, we know this from our practice, that this is the essence of what we are doing, is we are continuing to engage in actions and always having that mind state of dedicating, sealing, protecting that merit, with the goal of becoming enlightened. They use the analogy of you're like putting drops of water in a bucket. To get the whole bucket filled takes many drops of water, but you need to put them somewhere where they can be safe and continue to accumulate to eventually create the final result, the full bucket of Buddhahood. So whatever virtues we gather, through the three times, past, present, and future, dedicate them to enlightenment. That's what we do at the end of every one of these classes, and at the end of every practice we do, even at the end of kind of ordinary actions we do. One of the things I do here generally every day, sometimes my partner will do it if I'm busy, but is to take food out to the birds. We have birds in the front that are lawn eaters, and then we have bird feeders in the back that other birds come to. But you do that, of course, with good motivation. And don't think I'm just out there throwing bird seed to these particular birds to feed them. I'm doing this with bodhicitta motivation, so it can become the cause for all beings to attain not just temporal happiness, but to attain the ultimate happiness and bliss of Buddhahood. And then you dedicate. If you forget to dedicate, they say the danger is that that kind of dissipates. That energy you've created isn't really contained and held, and it can be subject to damage to some degree as well, because after we feed the birds, maybe somebody comes knocking on our door and they're all upset at us at the way we parked our car or something, and then we have to get into a whole altercation with them, and we've just dissipated all that wonderful positive energy. So dedication is a very important practice. It's essential that we do this if we are ever going to fill our bucket with all the merit. Going back to that little chart, I might point that out in regard to this chart that I shared earlier of how you proceed on the Mahayana path. It's not just the main thing that kind of advances you forward, particularly once you start entering into these 10 grounds, is the wisdom realizing emptiness that acts as an antidote to more and more of what obscures the mind. I'm going to talk about those things in a moment. But you'll notice at the very top of this chart, it says first great countless eon, second great countless eon, third great countless eon. That's not necessarily time. It is the amount of merit that you need to accumulate to accompany that realization of wisdom. We need to continually put merit in the bank. You cannot get to enlightenment without this huge store of merit that acts as the gas in the tank, if you will, to propel you forward through your wisdom realizing emptiness to remove layer after layer of these obscurations. So that merit has to be dedicated. It has to be focused with the intention of accomplishing that goal. I mean, this is again the power of our minds. Through our minds, we create that merit. Through our minds, we dedicate that merit so that it is intent upon achieving the result that we seek. That's again the whole logic of why we dedicate at the end of classes or end of our practice, what have you. Then it says there in the third line of verse 23, disperse your merit to all sentient beings. This is that idea of we give it to them. We really want them to be the beneficiaries of what we've created. And that's done through dedicating for enlightenment, because the mind of enlightenment, bodhicitta, desires to benefit beings. And that's its main focus. And then we recognize to do that, we have to become a Buddha. But the main goal is to benefit all beings. So disperse your merit, give your merit to all sentient beings, and utter the peerless aspiration prayers of the seven limbs at all times. Kind of hard to do at all times, but the seven limb prayer, I think most of you have heard of it. It is a wonderful, very powerful practice that helps us to do some main activities, particularly accumulation of merit, like I was just talking about, but also purification. And also, of course, the last of the seven limbs is dedication, which is, sealing that merit in the way that I talked about. Let me go to the slides. Um, Oh, you know what I did is I skipped. I was supposed to go to 26. Let's go to 23. That's because, 23 starts talking about dedication. In James Apple's translation, he moves 26, the two lines from that up before this kind of part. But let me go, as long as I'm on this one, I've done this twice tonight. I just realized, I've got these kind of things I got out of order a little bit, but sorry. The seven limb practice, most of you know this, but it involves first prostrating. It doesn't mean you necessarily have to physically prostrate, but it is good to put your hands at your heart with the thumbs tucked into your hands, and then at least have the humility that is involved in prostrating. An antidote to our pride, prostrating before the holy beings. Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and so on. Offering, wanting to create that mind of generosity that wishes to offer what we've physically arranged as well as what we are mentally imagining. Confessing, this is similar to the four opponent powers of purification that are an important part of our daily practice. In that part of the seven limb practice, you're bringing to mind what you have done that has been non-virtuous and confessing it and wishing to purify it. You can even do in each of these limbs more extensive practice, but oftentimes it's simply recited as a 7-line prayer. Fourth one, rejoicing. We talked about rejoicing already tonight. Rejoicing is having a very positive mind while observing the good effects, good results that people are experiencing in their lives, as well as the good things that they did to create those. And then the next two are both kind of supplications, requests that we're making to the holy beings. First, for them to remain, to not kind of exit stage left, but to be among us in a way that can benefit us. And then while they are here, to teach, to share the Dharma. We don't want these holy beings to just be here in our world and not do that. We want them to be here and remain here and to continue to turn the Dharma wheel. And then the limb of dedicating that I already talked about. So again, this is just some additional advice that's being given by Atisha that's very consistent with our tradition and the types of practices that we've adopted. There's a wonderful presentation of the 7-limb prayer in the second and third chapter of Way to the Bodhisattva, Shantideva's text. Very extensive confession verses in that second chapter in particular. But these 7 limbs are, as again, a way that we can accumulate all this positive potential, this merit that we need as the gas in the tank, and purify any of the negativities that we've done so that we can have good fortune in terms of our practice, not be thwarted by those negative deeds. So we end up in unfortunate states and so on. Okay, so I'm going to skip 24. We'll kind of have to come back to it and recognize, its relevance there. But as I said, James Apple, when he teaches, or when he assembled his translation in the biography of Atisha that he did, he put the last 2 lines of verse 26. Remember, we talked about verse 26 way back when we went through the 7 riches. The last 2 lines of this are, among others, guard your speech. When alone, guard your mind. So again, if I had taught this in the right order, then this would be kind of the ending advice in terms of the advice about how to go about living the Bodhisattva's way of life and having a compassionate life. And I think this is a really important kind of 2 lines. The idea is that when we are with others, what are we most compelled to be attentive to? It's what we're saying, right? Because that's the way that we are interacting with others mostly. Yes, sometimes there's physical actions going on as well, but it's mostly verbal. When we are with others, we are saying things that can either cause harmony and people to feel good about themselves and life and have more positive things that reinforce good behavior in their life, or we can do the exact opposite and we can just rain on their parade and do all kinds of things that upset them and cause them to have negative states of mind and so on. There's a lot of power behind our speech. I mentioned even earlier tonight that there's a lot of references to speech at various points in this text because this is, as the way I see it, one of the, again, most direct ways that we do have an impact on others is by what we say to them and how we say it. I think I may have mentioned this when I talked about it earlier, but I'll say it again. This wonderful teacher in the Vipassana tradition, Eric Kolvig, I've read his teachings that he gave on the Noble Eightfold Path, which is a more Theravadan approach to the path to attaining nirvana. But the idea is that among those is right speech, correct speech, mindful speech. And in that teaching, he says we should ask ourselves 2 questions before we share anything out of our mouths. The first is, what am I saying? What is it that is going to come uttering out of my mouth? Really think about the words you are going to say. But secondly, and maybe more importantly, why am I saying it? And we really have to think about why we are offering those words. We a lot of times just feel like there's just a natural compulsion to just start saying things, to share things, but we don't really think about, well, why am I saying that? Is the motivation really pure? Do I really want to benefit that being? Is there something, some, again, maybe ulterior motive, like I said earlier? Or is there even some way that I'm trying to assert my own knowledge and, you know, skills and ability in the face of that person? Is it, where is that coming from? And then I think there's also that one that I've seen online attributed to the Buddha, but I don't know if it's really a quote from the Buddha, who quote essentially says, "Don't speak unless you can improve on silence." There's something kind of noble about silence, about not always feeling like we need to fill the air with our own molecules of sound. It is important at times that we practice silence, that we just be with another and don't always feel like we have to interject with things that we feel we need to say, but perhaps are really not relevant or useful. I know people are uncomfortable with silence often. I mean, look at how much I talk in the course of an hour and a half teaching, but nonetheless, you're all here to hear words, not to hear silence. So, but the idea is that when we are with others, there's oftentimes we feel there's no invitation for silence. We feel like we need to fill those gaps between what they're saying and then we have to say something and they say something. It becomes, again, is everything necessary? But especially when we're working with people who really need someone to listen to them, you know, shut off our mouths for a while, just be with somebody, try to be as compassionate and empathetic with them as possible. That's going to be of much greater value than us just throwing out things that we think might be useful to them that are really just coming perhaps from our own ego. So that first line, when with others, guard our speech. That's so important because that's how we make or break so many of our relationships. And of course, it's how we benefit others or perhaps, harm them by virtue of what we're saying to them. The second line, when alone, guard your mind. This is our big job, right? I think I may have mentioned that quote this is a quote from Geshe Ben Kongyo, who said, standing at the door of the afflictions, holding the spear of the antidotes. Other than this, I have no other job. That's our mental work, is to be attentive to what's going on with our minds and have an antidote to anything that is negative that arises. Again, that's pretty tall order. We still have a tendency for attachment and jealousy and pride and anger and what have you to arise. But our job is to be there with the spear of the antidotes, the things that will directly counteract those thoughts. The thoughts of anger and hatred, we try to generate the antidote of love. With regard to jealousy, we saw earlier, we generate the antidote of rejoicing. With regard to attachment, craving, desire, we generate the antidote of understanding impermanence and the unsatisfactory nature of those things. Again, there are different antidotes that are taught that are really useful. That's what we need to be doing when we're alone, is guarding our minds whenever we see all these various thoughts arising that are not in line with the Buddha's teachings. We need to be diligent and do what we can to counteract those. Otherwise, while we're alone, we just let our minds go wherever they want to go. And then, of course, when we're with others, those things are going to spill out in terms of unhealthy states of mind and behaviors with others. So let me go back to where I was going to talk about this. I might first point out that in James B. Apple's translation, I liked his phrasing of this because I like the kind of the rhyming to some degree of the last word of these two. Examine your speech while among the multitude. Examine your mind while in solitude. So the idea is, again, when we're out among people, our speech is the most important thing to guard, to examine, to be aware of. And then when we are by ourselves, pay attention to our minds. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay attention to our minds when we're with others. It just means that that's the main job when we are alone, is to attend, because we're generally not speaking to others or engaging in physical actions. We need to be attentive to what's happening in our mind. This is what Geshe Ngamandargi says. When with others, we should be mindful not to harm them by careless remarks. One of the Kadam masters said, we make personal judgments and accusations as if they were all true. I wish there were locks on my mouth and on everyone else's as well. Right? This is the tendencies. We just say things and we just make judgments and make, all kinds of statements about others and saying things. And, first of all, a lot of what we say is just our opinion. Your opinion is just your own little judgment that is grounded in your own particular distorted mind. It's not necessarily reality. maybe it's good if we had locks on our mouths, all of us, for at least a portion of our day. He goes, when alone, that second part of it, we should examine our thoughts. Without the attainment of single pointed concentration, our mind is like a restless child. But even before we attain that single pointedness, we should always try to bring our mind back to a state of stable concentration, back to some clarity, some single focus that will allow us to know what's going on in our minds and do what is appropriate to counteract what is negative. Then he shares this little story about somebody who, of course, in their meditation, when they were trying to develop some skill around their mind, didn't really do it right. The story is often told of a merchant who, during his meditation, would think about his business so that he could formulate how to instruct his employees. However, whenever he arose from his meditation, he would forget what he had devised and want soon to return to his contemplation. This isn't the best use of our meditation, try to figure out the problems we're facing in our daily life. That's not the goal of meditation. Making plans during meditation can easily become so habitual that we achieve a certain sense of enjoyment from time spent meditating. In quotes there, of course, because it's not really meditating. We must avoid such gross mental wandering. Again, so I went through 23. Let's go on to 24. But again, if I had managed to get that in the right order, we would have covered that as kind of the last bit of advice and then gone into this verse that's essentially saying, whatever virtues we gather, we need to dedicate and engage in this 7-limb prayer. Now we go to verse 24, and this is actually the last verse according to how we're doing this, because again, we covered 25 and 26 previously when we talked about the 7 riches, or 7 wealth, 7 gems, whatever. Verse 24 says, if you proceed thus, you'll swiftly perfect merit and wisdom. Again, the 2 wings of a bird, sometimes called the method wing or the compassion wing, that's merit. And then the wisdom wing, which is that deeper wisdom of emptiness in particular, that is so essential to removing everything that obscures our minds. That's what's mentioned in this very next line. And eliminate the 2 defilements. What are the 2 defilements? Okay, so I think, again, I don't think I've touched on this in this course, but if we go back to this idea of the Bodhisattva going through this process of development, it's mentioned in this chart here, right? That I've been sharing with you a couple of times tonight. The Bodhisattva begins this process when they enter this point G again. They develop the wisdom realizing emptiness in a direct manner. It's not conceptual. It's a wisdom that arises through this deep meditation where emptiness, the object that is being meditated upon, and the mind meditating upon it are like water poured into water. They become kind of one. There's no dualistic sense of a subjective mind and an object being known. This is a profound realization that begins your process of removing first the first set of defilements, which are called the afflictive obscurations. They're in this little box on the lower right-hand side here. The afflictive obscurations are your ignorance, your conception of inherent existence, along with its seeds. The seeds being the imprints from those that we will have that ignorance generating again and again. All of that can be removed, as well as all the afflictions, such as attachment, jealousy, pride, hatred, and so on, that are built on that misconception that thinks that things exist inherently. That's the root of all of samsara, is our ignorance. That the Bodhisattva removes on these first 7 grounds. When you get to this point H here, at that point, you have essentially become kind of an arhat. You've attained the state of complete freedom from samsara. But for the Bodhisattva, that's not a stopping point. They continue on in what are called the 3 pure grounds, these last 3 levels, to remove what are called there, going down to that lower box on the right-hand side, the cognitive obscurations or knowledge obscurations. These are what obscure you from attaining enlightenment. The first, the afflictive, are what keep you from attaining liberation, nirvana, the state of an arhat. Here, these are what keep you from being a Buddha, from having the fully enlightened mind of a Buddha and the omniscient wisdom that goes with it. So essentially, those are the imprints of the conception of inherent existence and all factors of mistaken dualistic appearance that arise due to its force. Maybe I'll send this chart out with Sheila as well, so you can at least have it to refer to. But these are much subtler obscurations, and that's why they are abandon last, is you get the grosser things first, and then you get to this subtle obscuration that is the imprints or kind of the predispositions of this ignorance that give rise to a false appearance. They make everything appear as if it exists on its own, independently, inherently, when, of course, the wisdom is already there that knows they don't exist this way, but you haven't removed what causes that dualistic appearance. So when you're out of meditation, that dualistic appearance is still there. You need to remove that. That's the veil that keeps you from having a fully enlightened mind. And there's a lot more that could be said about that and that whole chart. I've actually done a whole course on the grounds and paths as they're taught in sutra. But nonetheless, this is the process, is that you go through first removing these afflictive obscurations so that you're free of any of that ignorance and what arises on the basis of ignorance. And then in the last three levels, you remove those subtler obscurations that keep you from being a Buddha. Let's finish the text, and then I'm pretty much it. So at 9 o'clock your time, which is where we're supposed to end. So I don't know what we'll do about questions, but let's see. Last two lines. Since your human existence will be meaningful, you'll attain the unexcelled enlightenment. Since we've made our existence meaningful with this life and whatever other lifetimes we need to attain Buddhahood, we will eventually attain it. When you create the causes, the result will follow. Whether you want the result or not, it's going to follow if you've created all the causes and conditions. So I do like James B. Apple's way of restructuring the text so that it kind of ends on that note. You'll attain the unexcelled enlightenment. You will actually achieve Buddhahood if you engage in, the path in this way, Bodhisattva behavior in this way. Let me just share on the slides. I don't have anything more to share on that except some final advice. This is just a few things from Geshe Awan Dargye. He says the teachings outlined in this text are not solely for Dharma practitioners, but can help anyone who simply wishes to lead a good life. That's why I called this course How to Live a Compassionate Life. Whether or not we accept such doctrines as past and future lives, if we act as if they did exist, there will be only benefit for ourselves and others. That's why I like to frame it that way. If there aren't past and future lives, well, we might not live as meticulously, certainly, but if we hold the awareness that there is, whether or not there is, then we do pay attention to what we do with this life. We should be friendly towards others, yet at the same time as stubborn as an ox when it comes to maintaining the purity of our practices. There's a Tibetan proverb, wrap the rope from your nose around your head. Animals who are led by a rope through their nose or a ring in their nose are forced to follow where others lead them. However, if this rope is wrapped around their own head, they remain docile and friendly, free to roam where they wish. So it's like be your own disciplinarian, be your own guide. In a similar manner, if we wrap the rope of ethical discipline around our own head, it's unnecessary to follow some outer imposition of morality. If our discipline comes from within us, we need no external authorities as guides. Dharma practice should not be done as mere ritual out of obligation or because it is popular. We should not follow Buddhism because it has a growing reputation or has become a trend, but because we realize its benefits. No matter what practices we do, if they help our mind, they are worthwhile, and this in turn helps all others. I might mention on that previous slide where it said, you need no external authorities or guides. Well, that's when you've developed that kind of inner guru, that is the inner wisdom that you can practice from. We do need guides. We do need people that can give us the coaching and guidance on our path so that we can get to that point. Remember, the job of the outer guru is to awaken the inner guru. And once the inner guru is awake, then the outer guru is not as important, right? Because the development all has to happen from within. The outer gurus can only do so much. Yeah. So it's kind of the meaning of that. But any comments or questions from anything I've talked about tonight? See anything in the chat box? Anyone? I know it's a lot to think about, and we've digested this text in a pretty quick way over these 5 classes. But hopefully, again, this is something. And if you do have, the book from Geshe Awan Dargye, or you can look up Alex Berzin's teachings again or online. They're really quite sweet, quite nice. There's the other book I mentioned by Lama Gyurme that's available pretty easily. But this is something you can always go back to. And maybe even just after having done these 5 classes, pick 1 or 2 things that you would like to simply work on. Maybe it's that one we covered towards the end. I'm going to be as careful as I can when I'm with others in guarding my speech. That's a huge task right there. If you do that well, you know, I prostrate at your feet. So, and then when we're by ourselves in solitude, do what we can to guard our minds, to keep our minds as focused and concentrated, to be attentive to what's arising, and to do what we can to change our minds. So, all right. And again, I hope that you all are able to go to Kandurla's teachings next Tuesday. Everything's still on for that. Yes, it's all happening. So how exciting, how wonderful. I'm envious in a good way that you have the opportunity. So I may try to tune in. I don't know. It is available online. Yes. Yes. Okay. I will try to register and get ready to do that next Tuesday because I would very much like to attend her teaching. But let's do our dedication prayers to conclude tonight, as well as to dedicate all the positive potential we've created throughout our time together over these sessions. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may we quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. In this wonderful prayer for bodhicitta to never decline in the least, but to always continue to grow, exponentially. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And then the prayers for His Holiness. As we recite this prayer, I think we're not just creating the causes for his good health, long life, for his wishes to be fulfilled, but the same for all of our precious gurus who are still, in this world, helping us and others on our path. The wish granting, wish fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And then this wonderful prayer for everything to go very auspiciously, very well, for Lama Zopa Rinpoche's reincarnation to be found and to be raised in the Dharma, to be an amazing being of great benefit to ourselves and to all others in this world. Peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable Venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and for mother living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss! Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. Lastly, we'll do what we've been doing at the end of all of these, dedicating in a more specific way for those beings that we know who are experiencing difficulty, or even parts of the world right now where there's great suffering due to war, humans harming each other, harm from the elements, conflict, in whatever way we want to kind of share this positive energy. Remember at the beginning in the motivation, we talked about kind of how do we feel? We feel so insufficient in dealing with the suffering of the world. Well, this is one way that we also kind of remedy that by thinking that what we have done benefits other beings. Those that we know of and those we've heard of who are experiencing suffering, may they be free of that through what we've done here tonight and throughout this course. And may they also have all the causes that will lead them on a path to true, perfect peace and happiness. And then extend this out to all beings. May all beings, without exception, also have these same results of perfect happiness, complete freedom from suffering through what we've done together in this course. Thank you all for the opportunity to share this with you, and I look forward to seeing some of you at some point, and hopefully in the future, and certainly seeing you online. I'll plan to join next Tuesday. Probably see you in the Zoom room then, though many of you may be actually there in person. Yes. So Anyway, have a wonderful visit with Kandralal and practice well. And I will see you again soon.